In all of our passages today, I am hearing a theme about choice. In our Old Testament lesson, we have Joshua, who took over leadership of the Israelites after Moses died, and he's pressing the people to choose who they will serve. This passage is frequently quoted. We love to cross-stitch it onto pillows and hang it in cross-stitches by our door. Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. The decisiveness of it is bold and appeals to us, so you'll find this Bible verse on lots of things. The gospel passage is a little less popular to embroider on cushions, but we have the familiar parable about the 10 bridesmaids, 5 of which are prepared with extra oil, and 5 who are not. The 5 who are prepared with extra oil choose not to share with the other 5. And traditional readings of this parable are about the second coming of Christ, emphasizing that we should be like the wise bridesmaids and be prepared for Jesus to return, for we don't know the day or the hour. It could happen anytime. I think that's a bit more modern reading than probably what Jesus intended. Matthew's gospel would have been written almost 85 years after Jesus' death. Matthew's audience would have been culturally Jewish and a generation or two removed from Jesus' lifetime. And almost 20 years before the writing of Matthew's gospel, the Roman Emperor Nero had begun the brutal persecution of Christians in Rome, and persecution was happening elsewhere in the empire. Not only were the Christians still waiting for Jesus to return, many were already suffering, already being targeted. Because of this, many of the gospel parables and letters from Paul have these apocalyptic overtones, just like today's parable about the end of the world, Jesus' second coming. These apocalyptic stories were less about the literal end of the world and more to encourage the earliest Christians to say, your suffering is temporary. It will end any time. We don't know the day or the hour when Jesus will come back, literally or metaphorically. Your suffering is temporary. Have hope. Stay strong. He wanted to, these stories, give them hope and urge them to stay committed to the teachings of Christ and hold on to their faith through the terrible persecution that was starting. So if we read the parable about the 10 bridesmaids in the stay committed to Jesus' teachings lens rather than be prepared for the end of the world lens, what then can we learn from the parable? I want to look at the end first, because sometimes Jesus gives us the answer at the end of parables. And he says, keep awake. That appears to be the warning, the lesson from the parable. The whole point of the story, keep awake. And in the parable, all 10 bridesmaids fall asleep. We're often taught the parable as a lesson in being prepared. The 5 foolish bridesmaids don't have enough oil. They weren't prepared. The other 5 brought extra oil and were prepared to wait the long delay for the bridegroom to arrive. So they were. But the final instruction in the parable isn't be prepared, it's stay awake. But all 10 fell asleep. In Greek, this word translated as awake can mean literally keep yourself from falling asleep, but the usage of it in this parable is a little unique. Every other time Jesus uses this word, other than one time here in Matthew and one time in Mark in a similar parable about the master of a house returning suddenly from a journey, these are the only 2 times he uses the word awake, this warning, stay awake in a parable. Every other time Jesus uses this phrase, he's begging the disciples to literally stay awake and pray for him. Keep watch. Pray with me. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus weeping tears of blood and praying for God to save him from the terrible pain he knows is coming, and he begs his friends, stay awake and keep watch. Stay vigilant so you don't fall into temptation, and pray. When he comes back, he finds them sleeping and says, Peter, could you not stay awake even 1 hour with me? I had the great honor of visiting the traditional site of the Garden of Gethsemane when I was in the Holy Land in January of 2020, and they have this verse engraved on a plaque on a wall outside, a stone wall outside of the garden. They translate it as, "Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter temptation." Instead of "keep awake," this translation used "watch." So stay awake when Jesus says it. Other than these two instances, it's almost always stay awake, keep watch, and pray. He's asking them to stay awake with him and asking for their support, asking out of a deep emotional need for connection to them and to God. He begs his friends not only to pray, but pay attention to what's happening around them. Not only as an act of service, but an act of love to comfort him. So what I'm learning from the parable of the 10 bridesmaids today is that all 10 fell asleep and failed to pay attention to their surroundings in time to show love and care to one another. All 10 failed the final instruction of the parable to keep awake. Reading the parable and approving of the 5 bridesmaids who refused to share their oil feels like a very modern interpretation as well. Every man or bridesmaid for themselves. But Jesus' world was much smaller than ours, much more interdependent. If all 10 bridesmaids had stayed awake and vigilant, the 5 prepared ones might have noticed that the others would run out of oil in time for them to go buy more, or even to share. The 5 unprepared bridesmaids might have realized their mistakes sooner if they'd been awake and paying attention. Then all 10 could have unified, shared their oil, helped each other, divided it up amongst them, and waited to light the lamps to conserve the oil until they heard the cry, "The bridegroom is coming," then they can light their lamps. So many problems would have been solved if all 10 had remained awake, or even 1 had remained awake to keep an eye on things. We can learn from this parable. And I don't think the moral of the story is to leave other people hanging out to dry when we're all facing the same struggle. All 10 bridesmaids fell asleep, but I don't think any of them needed to be left out of the celebration. We can shift our perspective, stay awake with Jesus to pray, and in doing so, pay attention to the world around us, stay vigilant, resist the temptation of falling asleep to the suffering in the world. This might mean looking an unsheltered neighbor in the eye instead of looking away. It might mean taking time to learn about the conflicts in the Middle East. It might mean giving a helping hand when we're able to help a neighbor in need. Maybe move some furniture or bring a meal. This is our 21st century way of keeping awake, not falling asleep to what's around us. We can share resources with others in so many different ways. One way is by making a pledge to St. Anthony's to support our mission to help gather people, grow them, and go out into the world changed. Another way would be to donate food to our food drive. Another way would be to donate money to Episcopal Relief and Development for their work on the ground in Gaza. We have so many ways that we can share our resources. We don't have to hoard them. We don't have to leave anyone outside in the dark. Rather, we have real power as individuals, families, and a church community to stay awake and make a real difference to the people around us, to impact lives here and beyond. And children of God, that is good news. Amen.